Thank you so much to the whole ISOC committee. I'm really honored to be here. I was just explaining to the committee that we have a couple of Cambridge graduates here in Tübingen, and they were all very jealous that I got to come and talk with you all today, because obviously Cambridge is so near and dear to all of us. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming to hear this talk. I know that it's always a stressful time for a Cambridge student. I don't think there's ever not such a stressful time. So I really appreciate you even taking the time to come and listen. And I hope we'll have lots of time to converse, because I'll speak for as short a time as possible, really, to give you the information. And then I'd love if you have questions and we can chat about the material further, and hopefully inspire some of you to dig into this material yourselves, inshallah. So let me now share my screen, and it worked earlier, so we'll hope again. This one and this one, yeah. Okay. Perfect. Is that Basil? Give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is really give you just a little sampling of what we can learn if we study the devotional writings of Morisco communities in Spain. So the outline of my talk tonight is really just a very simple foray into their works, into their written works that we have access to. But before we do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of historical context, as well as show you some beautiful pictures, because that's always gives life to any history presentation, and also show you and read from their works together, because I think that really is the most enriching way of studying their text. And since we only have an hour, I'll try and contain myself to 30 or 40 minutes, and then hopefully we can have a really good chat. So what is this picture, first of all? Does anyone have a guess what this might be? You can shout it out. I forget we're not in a classroom.
Is that the Quran?
Yeah, very good. Can you recognize maybe the surah that it is?
Surah Al-Fatiha?
Yes, excellent. Sorry, I can't see who's speaking, but very, very good, right? So you are not afraid of seeing a manuscript. And I hope that if that's the minimum that you take away from this presentation, then that will be very well pleased, because manuscripts look really scary, but actually they're really, really inviting and really special, and frankly, not that intimidating once you sort of dive in there. So you've already seen that there is a manuscript. You've identified that it's in Arabic. You've even identified that this is a passage of the Quran, and you've even identified what surah it is. And you are exactly right and correct in your guess. And so this is a surah, a copy of the Quran, which was written in the 1600s. 1500s. We don't exactly know the date, but it's around the middle of the 16th century. And in this little book on the left here, this bound book, what we find is an example of many, many, many different kinds of little bound books and volumes and bundles of papers that were found all together in one part of Spain. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And these texts belonged to communities called Moriscos. So who are the Moriscos? Hold on, there we go. So before I can tell you who they were, we have to kind of do a very tiny, short, condensed history of Al-Andalus in 1 minute, which is basically, can you all see my pointer? No, you can't. So the first one on the left is the map of the first conquest of Spain in 711. And that goes all the way up to basically the boundaries of modern day France. And then on the map one over this way, you have the kind of first pushback, and you have the first Cordoban Caliphate, and this would be around the 900s till around the mid 1050s. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the next map of Islam in Spain, which is after 2 Berber conquests, as well as much more pushback from the Christian kingdoms in the north. And this map would be around the 1190s, let's say, until the 1230s, until we get to the final map, which is the last kingdom of the Muslim domination in Spain, of Muslim rule, and that was the Nasrid kingdom of Granada. And that was established around the 1230s, some 1250s, until 1492, when the Christian conquest of Granada officially ended Islamic rule in Spain. So that's your very condensed, super fast history of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. But I think this is important to know because we need to understand that in these areas, see the areas that are in green, plenty of Christians and Jews and other religious groups are living under Muslim rule. And the areas that are not in green, plenty of Muslims are living under Christian rule. So already by the 1000s, there is quite an established precedent of Muslims living under Christian rule in these areas that are in pink, orange, yellow, and blue, and etc. Any questions about that so far? Is that all okay? So the Christians that lived under Muslim rule were called Mozarabs, and they were, as I said, Christians that lived under Muslim rule. Sorry, the slide's gone all weird a little bit. And they spoke many different languages. We know a lot about their communities because they wrote in Arabic, and they had a lot of different cultural associations with Arabic. So they became an Arabized Christian minority in the north. And that's really important because this is the first time we start to see language adopted by groups that didn't traditionally speak that language, but adopted and used in their religious texts, in their religious expression, and even in their devotional lives. And this begins early in this period. I would say by the 900s, you start to see this. And Jewish communities are doing the same. They're also using Arabic to communicate religious doctrine, to write their most intense sort of philosophical, theological tracts. These are being written in Arabic. But they do something even more intriguing, which is to continue using Hebrew as the script. So this is called Judeo-Arabic. Some of you might be familiar with this. And this is Arabic, but written in the Hebrew script. So you see this precedent now of language script hybrids as well. And just to give you an example, this is a Hebrew translation of what was actually written in Arabic. And some of you may know Maimonides, one of the most important, influential Jewish theologians, philosophers. So he wrote most of his works in Arabic, and then they were later translated into Hebrew later, and in Judeo-Arabic specifically. Now, what about the Muslims who lived under Christian rule? So they were called Mudejars, and that word has a really interesting etymology. We're not exactly sure where it comes from, but most theories agree that it's probably from the Arabic word Mudejar, which means to, in its nicest connotation, to remain behind, and in its kind of more pejorative connotation, it means to be tamed or domesticated. You know, somebody who doesn't have a free will, but somebody who's kind of under the control of somebody else. So obviously this was a name given to these communities by their Muslim co-religionists in the South. So the Mudejars, we are most sort of famous, and perhaps they're most famous for their buildings and architecture that they've left behind. And they had a very particular style of building which is now called Mudejar architecture. And that's visible in a very visual way. If you travel through Spain, some of you might have had the good fortune to do that. If you haven't, I would highly recommend it. And you'll be able to see this Mudejar architecture everywhere. And I'll just show you a few buildings that we have. So this is, you know, an example of classic Mudejar architecture, a very Catholic building that was used and definitely built by Muslim architects, builders, construction workers, plaster workers. So the craftspeople who knew these crafts were Muslim generally and predominantly. And so anytime you wanted to build, you know, a big exorbitant building, you would generally hire Muslim craftspeople. And that's why these buildings share this incredibly rich and what we might call Islamic aesthetic. Although I know that's debated. No Islamic art historians here to push my, you know, to push me back on that. So this is another example from the same building. These are two small examples of more churches, but again, look at the style, just get a feel for how much this flavor of building, of visual aesthetic was a part of the different landscapes. Oh, sorry. This is a game I usually play when we're in person. I ask you to guess what kind of building it is. So everybody usually says, oh, that's a mosque. And then I get to be like, no, it's a church. So obviously I can't do that with you now, but you can pretend in your head, what building is this? And you can pretend to say, oh, it's a mosque. And I'll say, no, it's a convent. So this is again another, I mean, this is a really difficult example because it really does look like a building in Fez or a building in Granada, and yet it's a convent purpose built as a convent. It's not a conquered building that was then repurposed. This is purpose built as a convent. And just look at the aesthetic. Okay, so the Mudejars very early, as we talked about the Mozarabs and the Jewish communities, the Mudejars are already also working with and playing with different script and language combinations. And all of that might have resulted in a really interesting history. We don't really know. If the Mudejars had been left as they were, who knows what kind of amazing Spanish Arabic texts we might have encountered, right? But history had a different plan. Qadr had a different plan. And what we saw is that the Christian conquest of Granada then makes every Muslim community under Christian rule. And what that means initially is not much different. The Christian rulers promise the Muslim communities that they'll be allowed to continue practicing their religion as they were under the Mudejar status, that they would have freedom to practice their religion, to butcher their meat in their own way, to dress as they wanted, and et cetera, et cetera. But that very quickly changes. And for lots of complicated reasons, which I can go into in the Q&A. And very quickly the rules change. And then several edicts are passed, which publicly and affirmatively ban all Muslim faith adherence to the faith, as well as any visible practice to it. And that happens by 1502. So in 1492, just imagine the conquest happens, then there's, the Mudejar status continues, and then suddenly by 1502, everything changes. And the first Muslims are converted in Granada and Castile, and then all over. And by 1525, every single Muslim community has been at least nominally baptized. Now, what does that mean for these Muslim communities? And what were they then after this? So these are the communities that we call Moriscos. And why we call them Moriscos is also very complicated and interesting. They didn't really refer to themselves as Moriscos. They actually referred to themselves as Musulmanes. In most of their texts, they call themselves Arabes, sometimes Musulmanes, Hispanioles. They use different words, but most often it's Musulmanes. So why do we call them Moriscos? It seems to have been a later import by different historians. And because it's the easiest way of referring to them, we have to be able to identify them as baptized Christians. And it's a little bit easier to say, really, than just baptized Christians who continued practicing Islam in secret and sometimes publicly. The shorter way of doing that is a Morisco, right? So the word has its problems, and I want that to be aware in the background, because I don't like calling people words that they didn't call themselves, right? But for simplicity, I think it does make things a little easier. So this is a picture of the Christian conquest of Granada, obviously many years later. But it tells you also the role that this plays in contemporary Spanish imagination. This is still a very big deal. So this is a German artist. His name was Christoph Weiditz, and he made some travels through the world and made all these beautiful sort of, what are these called? Graphs, I forget what these are called, of just images that he collected. So his little image dictionary is a wonderful resource of 16th century life from across the world. And he very happily, for us, traveled to Spain. And these are his images of what these Morisco communities look like. This is one of my favorite ones, especially because of this incredibly innovative baby carrier. What a way to go on the saddle. So this is obviously a Morisco family. And these are different images of what possibly Morisco women looked like. We don't know, right? Because this is through a German traveler's eyes, right? So take that with a grain of salt. What he saw might not be. This is another Morisca woman, we think. And you can see that they had distinctive dress sometimes, but not always. That's important to remember too. Different jobs that they did, right? Normal laborers. And of course, a Morisco party. This is called a dance. This is called the Zambra, which is a very specific kind of Andalusian musical harmony of different Jewish and Arabic and Semitic modes put into Western and North African melodies. It's quite something. So, so this gives you just a little sampling of what an outsider who visited these communities, what they saw. And the way that we know of these communities is through people like Christoph Weiditz, but also because of the Inquisition, which was heavily, in many areas, heavily persecuting these communities, along with other Jewish groups that were there, as well as, of course, Jews had been expelled in 1492, but many continued to stay and continued practicing in secret. And later in the century, then Protestant groups as well. So, or any Reformed tradition group. So just think about that for a minute. Think about the fact that now Islam is publicly prohibited in Europe, in this corner of Europe, which is a very important corner now strategically, globally. Remember that in 1492, not only was Granada conquered, not only were the Jews expelled, but also, Columbus sails the ocean blue and discovers a quote unquote, right, America. And this is now the epicenter of pre-modern, this is really the age of modernity has now begun. Of course, not historically and period wise, but something has shifted. Something is now different, where before, where religious groups were allowed to kind of coalesce, and of course there were more or less tensions, something has really shifted. And the Moriscos managed to continue practicing Islam somehow for over a century until their expulsion in 1609. So we know of their works through the Inquisition, the records of their persecution, things they were accused of, right? Bathing on a Friday, eating certain kinds of meat, not eating other kinds of meat, found to have been circumcised, things like that, right? And we also know about them through their own works that they wrote. And one of the biggest collections of their works is here near Zaragoza. It's a little tiny town called the Almonacid de la Sierra. And in this town, underneath the false floor in the 1880s, some builders were, taking down an old neighborhood, and they discovered a false floor, and underneath it was this huge, trove of books. And of course, they didn't know or care what it was, so they just kind of started throwing it in the pile with the other, wood and things to burn. And some children, as you do, they started a bonfire. And a priest who happened to be walking by saw that these books contained Arabic in them, and he knew this is something extraordinary. So the priest thankfully stopped the bonfire, and because of him, we have at least 300 of these manuscripts extant and with us, and that's how we get to see the Moriscos in their own words. So now I am very conscious that I've already talked a lot. I'm sorry. So I'm going to breeze through the rest of my slides, and then we'll read through some of their texts. So this is just to show you a little bit about what kind of things we find in their books. We find Arabic, as we saw before, and this is with vocalization. So that means the little vowels. We find Romance. So this would be a Castilian, Aragonese, Catalan dialect, but in actual Latin script. We find Arabic without vocalization, and there could be many reasons for why this is. Maybe somebody didn't come and vocalize it later, or maybe somebody didn't need it. Maybe their Arabic was actually good enough that they could just read it without vocalization. And then we find this, and this is called Aljamiado, and this is Spanish language, but in the Arabic script. Now, I can't see anybody, but is there any Spanish speaker? You can just say yes. No? Anybody?
I did Spanish A-level, but I wouldn't consider myself a Spanish speaker.
Okay, Spanish A-level, we'll take it. So do you think that do you have a reading knowledge of Arabic?
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to try reading this text? You can start with the black part underneath the yellow.
Okay. Ila irash shun. I can't really see that bit.
Very good. No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. You sound like me for at least 1 year of my PhD. That's exactly what I was doing. Staring at a screen going, Arracas, what are they saying? So this is truly an experimented reading. One has to really work hard and patiently with these texts, but it really does pay off. So let's read it together. So the yellow part says, El la Salah del Asr. Hang on, let me exit the screen so I can use my pointer. Is that okay? Can you guys see my pointer now? Yeah. So la salah, right? Salah del asr. So we know Salat al-Asr. Es cuatro rak'as. It's 4 rak'as, right? Y leerás, and you read en las dos primeras, and you read in the first 2, alhamdu, which is a shortening of Surah Fatiha. A surah and a surah, and kada al-raka. And the text goes on to say, in the second 2, you read alhamdu and no surah, right? So this is the kind of text that we find repeatedly in their collections. This al-Khamiado is probably the most, other than Arabic, vocalized Arabic, you would find this script language hybrid. And remember from earlier that this isn't necessarily something new, that populations in the Iberian Peninsula were already playing with things like this for a long time. And the Muslims are just now the new community to get on board with these script language hybrids. So let's see what else we find. Okay, let me show you all the slides and then we'll go to their text. So this writing of text, this producing of materials, this continues until the Moriscos were expelled from 1609 until 1614. And this is a really tragic story. Their expulsion, really, it was a very dark and sort of blight spot in this history. And it's still being dealt with in Spanish history in quite interesting ways. People, I think, are really reckoning with the expulsion of Jewish and Muslim communities and exploring, why did this happen? How did this happen? And what can we learn from how this happened? This is very much a living conversation in some circles. And this is a contemporary, at that time, an artist's description of what this expulsion looked like. Many communities were only given maybe 24 hours notice. Gather your things and get on a boat because you're leaving. So you can imagine what could they take behind, what could they take with them? What kind of, if somebody told you have to leave in 24 hours, what would you take with you? What would you store? What would you put in that false floor under your ground? I mean, really think about that as we leave the talk today. Think about what would I have taken, because that puts you in the mind of a historian. Then you're doing the historian's work and thinking, how do people behave? And this I'll come back to. We'll come back to this guy at the end, but I wanted to show you because this is a picture from their manuscript of what appears to be a teacher, right? But let's come back to this in a minute, because let's go to their works. So I'll exit this and let's see if I can very deftly move over here. Can you all see now what I'm seeing, which is a PDF? Yes? Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Basil. Okay. So what I thought we could do for the rest of the time that I have, what do I have? Like maybe 10 more minutes, 15 minutes? Basil, tell me what I've got. Amina, 10 minutes?
You can keep going, yeah, for about 10-15 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to try to go as slow as I can, but as fast as I can too, so I can show you a few things. So this is an example of one of the texts that I worked on in my dissertation, a very typical, I would say, Morisco text. This is a collection of fatwas, khutbas. This is a collection of khutbas, and you have to ask yourself, so now we know that Islam was prohibited. So why do they have a collection of fatwas? So khutbas, So some of them managed to be able to practice Islam openly. Some of them definitely had to keep it in secret. But if you lived outside of an urban center, in the mountains, in the villages, there were some places where baptism took place and the priest left, right? So for another 50, 60 years, nobody came to their town. So they just continued on as normal. And in places like this, perhaps this is where these texts found their life. So let's quickly read it just to get a flavor of what a typical Morisco Friday khutbah would have looked like. Let me pull it up. Sorry. Okay, can you all see? Yeah. So it says, okay, servants of Allah, Allah show mercy upon you. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has mandated obligations and commands. He does not receive you without them, and he is not satisfied with his servants without them. The first of them is the oneness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and to believe as certain in his lordship and belief in his angels and his scriptures and his messengers, and that you confirm this as true in everything that's apparent and in what is internal, and I think it would say external, but there's a little hole there. And the messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, be guardians of your as-sala'is, your ritual prayers, because the salah is half a pillar of our deen. Again, something's missing there. And the way and the path of our law. And the first that is seen of our deeds. Allah Azza wa Jal has said, maintain the prayer, for the prayer upon believers is a firm obligation. The Prophet ﷺ said that the likeness of the salah of the 5 as-sala'is is like a sweet seller that passes by one of your windows every day 5 times. Like so is the completion of the 5 as-sala'is with your wudu'es and with the completion of your arrakamientos, right? Your rakas and your as-sajdamientos performed with humility and maintained. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says they are the fortunate, the believers who in their as-sala'is are humble and in awe. So you can imagine now sitting in a gathering with the, this kind of faqih-like figure and see, what would have been told to you. These texts are full of normative Islamic doctrine. So many scholars who study Morisco texts initially tried to really look for kind of a hybrid religion, Muslims who are, mixing Christianity and Islam. And I found in my own work for sure that that is really not the norm. The vast majority of their texts are highly normative Islamic doctrinal texts that would really be at home in any Muslim context, other than the fact that they're in Spanish, right? Other than the fact that they're in Alfamiano. So let's read, if we can, a few descriptions of Moriscos talking about their baptism, talking about life in this time. So this is very early. This is by somebody named Ibrahim Brederemenyo. So he said this, when they baptized us, I recall the year of our conversion, that a most honored friend of mine, someone with whom I enjoyed a great friendship, a Carmelite friar called Fray Esteban Martel, a great friend of the Moors of this kingdom, more than other places. When he learned that we had been sentenced to become Christians by force, he sent one of the servants of his father's household for me, for at that time I was residing in the mosque of Cadrete. I immediately did what it was my duty to do, and as I reached his house, he stood waiting for me. As soon as he saw me, he greeted me warmly and then began to sob, half covering his face. He had me sit at his table, for it was mealtime, and served me pomegranates and Valencian conserve. And next, after that, a piece of roast meat. However, he ate nothing because it was Passion Sunday. After we had eaten, we entered the study of his father's house. And with tears in his eyes, he said to me, Bray, sir, what do you think of this upheaval and the unchristian way in which you are being used? For my part, I say, and it grieves my heart and soul to do so, that they have done you a great wrong. I replied that I was horrified that His Holiness had given his consent to any such thing and decreed it. He answered me saying that His Holiness had not consented, but that we had been sentenced by the Mantuan decree. This is all complicated things. So let's skip a little bit. And then he says, this friend was so moved by compassion for us that he never ceased to argue before the prelates and the councils against all those who had given their consent to any such thing and to inveigh against them. Together with many others, he issued a summons to protest and to argue strenuously against His Majesty and his ministers. He would have done so to some effect if he had not died within 2 months. He charged me to pray for him if he should die, for when I visited him, he was sick, and I wept when he died, for he was a loyal friend. And the reason why I included this text is because I want to give you an image of complexity. This is not just, one group of Christians. The Christian community, the Christian clergy were divided about what to do here. And the voices that succeeded were not necessarily the majority. They just ended up being the dominant voice, right? So in history, you have to be careful. The dominant isn't necessarily the majority. And this text gives you such a clear sense of the real friendships that many Muslims must have had with their Christian neighbors, and of the genuine pain that many of them must have felt at their fate. This is another text by a Morisco traveler, and this is toward the end of the 16th century, and he tells us of the kind of urban communities and how very careful they were about reading Arabic texts. So he said, when I wished to go to the city of Seville to leave the country of the Muslims, I went to the priest and told him, I'm planning to go to my town. My father wrote to me to come to him, and it's obligatory to obey one's parents. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong text. I'll skip this one. Let's read this one. So after greeting this community of people he's visiting, after greeting them in the customary way, I opened the book. But when they saw it was written in Arabic, they became extremely afraid because of the Christians. I told them, do not be afraid. The Christians honor me and respect me for my ability to read Arabic. But all the people from the town thought that the Christian inquisitors, who used to sentence and burn to death everyone who manifested his adherence to Islam in any way, or was reading the books of the Muslims, would condemn me as well. Driven by this extreme fear, the Andalusians, and by that he means the Granadans, used to be afraid of each other. They only spoke about religious matters with someone who was safe, that is, someone who could be trusted completely. Many of them were afraid of one another. Some of them who would have loved to learn something of the religion of God did not find anyone to teach them. After I decided to immigrate from that country to the country of the Muslims, I used to teach every Andalusian who wanted to learn, both in my own town and in the other towns I visited. Thus, when the Andalusians saw in what situation I found myself, they used to say to each other, "He will certainly fall into the hands of the inquisitors." This situation developed to such an extent that when I stopped by a group to have a talk, I saw that every one of them slunk away until I was left completely on my own. So this gives you an example of the Muslims during this time who would definitely have faced extremely violent, perilous persecution by the hands of the Inquisition, and what desperate times they were in. And yet, precisely in these regions, we find so many texts, so many different tracts and things that they continued writing, and evidence of their visual practice that they were able to do. So let's read about a Morisco woman, and I think we'll try and wrap up there. I have one more text I'll show you. I had a few more, but I'll try and keep it short. So this is a really beautiful text about a very special, very honored Morisco lady named Mura Oveda. We don't really know who she was. We never hear her name. She's just the Mura. So the Moorish lady from Oveda, who's mentioned so frequently in this commentary, and who was so famous in Andalusia and other parts, lived in Granada, near to the Elvira Gate. I paid her a visit on the Prophet's birthday. She was very old, and she could not make out letters of the alphabet, but she could argue cogently and with much sense, so it's hard to convey with what agility she moved within our honored Quran. Although her great age had had its effect, I could not outdo her, for her mental powers were too great. She was at the time some 93 years old. Her body and limbs were amazingly large. I never saw anybody like her, nor have I heard of anybody who ever saw a woman of such proportions. I'm not referring to her unusual appearance, but to the fact that her little finger She did have a niece, the daughter of one of her sisters, to whom she had left her third share and no more, because she said that a woman could not dispose of more than 1/3 of her estate if she was in good health and was more than 80 years old. She added that such women could always leave their property to those who maintained schools. She told me that if I wanted to stay and keep her company, she would bequeath me her books and her money. But because I did not have a Spaniard's covetousness, I did not accede to that suggestion. She then said, "Son, if perchance anybody should be fated to offend against himself once or many times, what he should do is to make excomo," but I think the manuscript now, I think we understand it says toba, against himself, and exchange his sins for good works, and for those sins of which he was not aware. He should perform a penance of 4 months. This is whenever his time comes, which will be the judgment day in the presence of the mercy of Allah. Granada and all the country around were governed by the word of this Mura. She never married and was said never to have known any man. The ordinary people of the region said that this Mura had more credit in matters of our religion and Sunnah than anybody. She was a great follower of Muhammad al-Ghazali, i.e. al-Ghazali. She was well known by all nations because she showed me letters from all 4 of the legal schools, besides others, great muftis and scholars. She never allowed herself to rest because she said that the highest form of jihad is to propound our religion in lands not ruled by Muslims. The suffering undergone in support of the religion will be her natural clothing. And if anybody should die in such a defense, all their sins will be to no effect and their soul will be exalted. We can skip a little bit. The more I used to rubricate, what made her great was the affection she showed to everyone. And this must not have been a matter of natural inclination, but of divine providence. She no longer kept the fast, nor did she perform her prayers except sitting down, and she never left home for any reason. As times were so bad for the Muslims, this Mura withdrew into the shade of her poverty and wept for the fall of the Muslims. She said to me, son, may it please the Almighty that this suffering is not as long and drawn out as I imagine it will be, because this last age is a payment for good deeds and for all the transgressions that have gone before. So this is a really special text. I really like sharing it in conversations about Moriscos, because you very rarely get, as we know, men tend to take center stage in historical sources. So it's always really nice to find such a personal relation about a female scholar and what seems to be an incredibly prominent and important person in early 16th century Granada. So I think we only have a few minutes left, so I thought it might be fun to just look at a little bit about Rajab. Get some advice. Since we're in the month of Rajab, I thought we could just take a tiny little sample of what these Moriscos say about Rajab. So I'll just show you this text. So it says the fourth month of the Islamic calendar is, I don't know if you can see this, Rabi al-Akhir, right? And the fifth one is Jamad al-Ula there. And the sixth one is Jamad al-Akhir here. And the seventh one is, the month of Rajab, la luna de Rajab. Y es la luna y mes que se llama mes de Allah. And this is the month which is called the month of Allah. Dicho Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Rajab is the month of God. Shaban y Shaban es mi mes, is my month. And the month of Ramadan is for the Ummah. Some of you might be familiar that it's a well-known hadith. Because Allah Ta'ala lo escucho, He listens in this month to any Abdu Adela lo escucho. He listens to any believing servant of His. And especially if that servant busies themselves here, con buenas obras, with good works. So take this Morisco advice as you are in Rajab and make it the month of Allah as we know it's supposed to be, and busy yourself with buenas obras, inshallah. And that is how you'll make these texts come alive. And so just to go back to this last picture before I wrap up, I'm sorry I went over time. It's just to show you again that, you know, I love showing this image because to me, this is the image of, I feel, again, if we have to call them Moriscos, even though they didn't call themselves that, this is the image I like to think that they would have been proud to have us see. An image that would have been true to the effect that what these texts tell us, the story that they tell us. This would certainly be true to that, of a teacher, of learning, of transmission, regardless of dearth of sources, regardless of, number of teachers, regardless of number of students, just to be there and to be, like as Mura Oveda said, propounding the religion even when it's difficult. So thank you so much.